It makes me feel like an old man to say this, but Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition is quickly approaching its 10th birthday. While the originals of all 5 Infinity Engine games will always have a place in the hearts of anyone who has played them, I think we're well past the point where we can admit that the Enhanced Editions have become the premier way of playing these games. Yes, they were really buggy when they first came out. Yes, they had some serious performance issues with certain hardware, and yes, it took a fair bit of time for the outstanding community to build the mod repository back up. But most of these issues have been sorted out at this point, not to mention that the game has been made much more technically sound with newer systems. Not only that, but the Enhanced Editions come with a fresh sprinkling of new content. New classes, quests, and items await the player in whatever adventure they embark on. The Baldur's Gate series, in particular, received 4 new fully fleshed out playable characters in the form of Rasad, the Sun Soul Monk, Nira, the Wild Mage, Dorn, the Blackguard, and Hexat, the Thief. The success of these re-releases led to the development and release of Siege of Dragonspear, a sort of interquel set between the first and second Baldur's Gate titles that was unquestionably loved by everyone and generated absolutely no controversy whatsoever. Volatile consumer opinion aside, Siege of Dragonspear was touted as the first new content in the Baldur's Gate series in almost 15 years, if you don't count the release of former Musings of an Idiot subject matter, Dark Alliance, and its sequel. Except it wasn't. To go along with the previously mentioned edition, the enhanced editions of both Baldur's Gate games came with a new campaign known as the Black Pits. These campaigns played much less like Baldur's Gate and much more like Icewind Dale, and if you've seen a certain other video on this channel, you know I'm down for that. The character creates a party of adventurers who suddenly find themselves kidnapped and thrown into a twisted fighting pit. In the first game, the pit is run by a drow by the name of Baeloth, while a man named Denethor rules over you in the sequel. Baeloth is voiced by one Mark Meer, known as the voice of Commander Shepard, and my goodness, is he magnificent.
Master, there is a matter requiring your attention in the Room of Pain.
Ah, already? I expected this one to hold out much longer. Well, any time is a good time for pain.
While the beneficiary of either man's insistent hospitality, the party is forced to fight in the arena as a means of prolonging their lives. Your victory is what alone keeps you alive. In between fighting for people's amusement, the party converses with the vendors who provide you with equipment to protect your sorry hide, as well as your fellow prisoners and potential future allies and enemies. Oh, and a beholder, because those guys are typically just sitting around, you know. And I mean, that's pretty much it. I wasn't lying when I said these campaigns were much closer to that of Icewind Dale. The story, for what it is, takes exactly the progression that you likely expect, with the party earning a chance at freedom by knocking the block off their captors and their cronies after laying waste to everything else put before them. Now, at this point, you might be wondering why any of this is actually worth talking about. The enhanced editions came with a few Zerg rushes, great, but at least in my opinion, they're actually quite a bit more than a bland slog through isometric CRPG combat. Let's go back to Icewind Dale for a moment. Icewind Dale is great. It's an awesome combat-oriented experience that consistently throws tough enemies and tougher bosses at the player over the course of its run. But it still has the player exploring towns and dungeons, almost necessitating that they bring along a paladin to act as the face of their party, and a thief to deal with any traps or locked chests they might come across. As you might imagine, considering most Infinity Engine-esque CRPGs aren't nearly so combat-based, those aspects are only doubly more important in other experiences. The Black Pits, by comparison, is basically nothing but combat that takes place from one instance to another, completely nullifying the need for a thief, paladin, or even a cleric should you so choose. Not only are combat situations separate from each other, but the player is automatically healed after every combat, because do you really think smart businessmen such as Baeloth or Denethor are going to let their prized assets die anywhere but the arena, showered by the adoration of countless fans? Yeah, I didn't think so. The Black Pits changes the needs of party composition in the way that it removes any sort of non-combat aspect as a decisionary factor. Class kits and items can make up for a lot, but no matter what way you slice it, thieves sacrifice fighting prowess for their vast number of skills, and paladins do so for charisma and personality. And spellcasting at some point. But you've got to remember that this is 2nd edition, so it doesn't exactly come around quickly. They are just worse than other classes in combat at the end of the day. Without the need for them, the player is free to just go absolutely balls to the wall in terms of offensive output. multiple fighters and spellcasters is the norm for this mode. It's like you get rewarded for creating the party you definitely did when you were a child and your brain wasn't developed enough to pick any class that wasn't fighter or mage. Not to worry, the other classes can still be valuable members of your party, and while it might not be technically necessary, I would recommend bringing along some form of divine spellcaster. Healing in these close-quarter situations can be a bit difficult, but you'll likely have a chance at the beginning of a brawl to throw down some buffing spells. Ironically, playing through these campaigns gave me the opportunity to experiment with some class loadouts that I typically wouldn't, and I have to say, I had a pretty damn good time with them. Let me know if you want some sort of video about odd class builds for these Infinity Engine games. That might actually be pretty fun to do. And I should point out, I used 2 different parties for each game for the express purpose of trying a bunch of different classes, but canonically, the same party is used for both games. The 2 campaigns carry along progressions that align with each game. The Black Pits found in BG1 is a low-level affair, while the BG2 expansion is high-level. The enemies fought reflect this. The toughest enemy you fight in the first game is Baloth himself, after the player likely cruises through a series of Gibberlings, undead, and other underlings. The second game, in comparison, eventually leads to the party fighting planar beings. The difficulty of these 2 chapters is drastically different, but not necessarily because of their difference in level. The first Black Pits is really easy. Almost too easy for the most part, though I am willing to admit that my having played through it multiple times at this point might be clouding my judgment a bit. But to put it in perspective, I deliberately designed the parties shown in this video to struggle, lacking any real physical range capabilities and meaningful offensive spell output, and there were still only 1 or 2 fights that gave me any real trouble. What makes the first game that much easier is not only the fact that most of your enemies are much more one-dimensional in the way they attack, but also that the party is allowed to buff themselves before actually going into combat. Baloth will just stare at you as you cast every spell at your disposal, and then be completely nonplussed when you speak to him ready to run through a wall. The staging area in the second game is a non-magic zone, meaning that isn't possible. So not only is it impossible for you to stack the deck before the fight begins, but the enemies themselves are far more capable of putting you over a barrel. Also, they love to kill your wizards. Leave me alone, please. As for which one is better, I'm not so sure there's actually an answer to that. They're basically one and the same. Black Pits 2 has a few more amenities, a few extra features that can spice things up, but the core purpose of both of them is identical. Personally, I'm privy to the second game just because I feel like it's a bit more geared towards someone such as myself, who I think could reasonably be considered both a veteran of D&D and these games. God, that sounds pretentious. Conversely, I could easily see how someone that might be newer to the Infinity Engine games, or just isometric CRPGs in general, might prefer the first. Let me just be clear, in case I skipped over myself. Black Pits 2 is hard. Even on normal difficulty settings, even with aids such as max hit points, even with min-max characters. Granted, it's not unfairly difficult or anything like that, but hard is hard. The first game might be too easy for my taste, but I could actually see myself recommending it to someone that actively has no idea how combat in these types of games work. The fights are easy enough and your characters progress at a pace that allows the player to easily become acclimated with what might be expected of them in combat down the line. In a lot of ways, it could be seen as a glorified training ground for players before starting something like Baldur's Gate proper, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. What I find somewhat interesting is that, while the second game clearly had a good deal more attention and care put into it stylistically, I'm hard-pressed to actually say it's better than the first in that regard. I mean, the fact that there are more NPCs to talk to, side quests outside of combat that actually affect your battles, far more rewarding incentives for replayability, and a greater connection to the main games, mainly through the appearance of characters such as the faithful romantic that is Voghiln, I don't know, however the hell you say his name, should make it more appealing, but it just doesn't. I think it just goes to show how important a villain, even in a game with a lacking story, is. On paper, nearly everything about the second game is better than the first, and yet it feels so bland in comparison. Denethor, along with his terrible Duke Nukem impression, is boring, and there's a real lack of tangible progress in the second game. Whereas you get to see Baloth grow more and more unhinged as you continue to win in the arena, there's nothing like that present in the sequel. The most the player gets is a few cutscenes they aren't even involved in. And it's all made worse that Baloth has a cameo. He's right there. Like I said, I still prefer the second due to the challenge and increased possibilities afforded by the higher level it takes place at. but Baloth is so enigmatic on his own that the meaningful absence of him is a heavy negative. A Black Pits type campaign with the expanded NPCs, mechanics, and combat of the second game with Baloth as a villain would probably have been ridiculously fun, and it's just a shame that the best parts of both couldn't come together. What I'll leave this video with is what prompted me to make it in the first place. Despite the fact that both of these games have been largely forgotten at this point, they've started to reach beyond the boundaries of themselves. At least, Baloth has. Not only has he gone on to appear in Idle Champions of the Forgotten Realms since the release of the Baldur's Gate games, but Mark Meer himself played the character in a charity PvP tournament that was sponsored by D&D. Next to Minsc, he's one of the only characters from the Baldur's Gate games to make any significant appearances outside of them. Not to mention that he is actually in Baldur's Gate as a companion, which at this point has to be an open secret. I'm not actually spoiling this for anyone, right? So do yourself a favor and acquaint yourself with the expansions that gave life to him. They might not be the most in-depth experiences, but hey, they're a good time, and sometimes that's all you can ask for.